When it comes to motion graphics, specifically After Effects, we cannot do much without actually starting to create what we call keyframes. As I've explained in the past, a keyframe is a place in time where something happens. What does that mean? Well, what are the things that we can do to a piece of footage? A layer, in our case, once we bring it into a composition. We can change all kinds of transformation values in it, such as rotation, scale, position, and such. Every time we change those values, those properties, we need to indicate the change by adding a keyframe. Now, the program is smart enough that it recognizes that you have set up a layer to be keyframeable. And in doing so, any change that you do subsequent to having set it up to be keyframeable, meaning you have set up an original keyframe, then you can go ahead and make changes to the particular values for that property on that layer. So how does that work? Well, I'm going to pick up where I left off on our last video, and I'm just going to go ahead and import a piece of footage into my project window. So I'm going to go into File, Import, Import File. Now remember, there are various options for importing items here. You can import one file. You can import multiple files through this software, or you can import file and then Shift select several items, or Control select several items, Option select on the Mac, several items within the import window, and go ahead and import with just a single file import call. You can also import directly from libraries if you have shared libraries that you have from other programs, or if you're working with a team that you have shared libraries of footage that you have available to you. You can import a Premiere project, and it will render things what you call sequences in Premiere. You will render them as compositions in this program. You can also save and re-export out to Premiere as well. You can also import other After Effects projects, and we're going to talk about these three things later on during the class. Just note that vanishing points is something that is being deprecated. Very limited use for it, and it's basically turning a Photoshop image into a 3D image, which you can do it fairly easily with the program. So with that, it requires, though, a workflow, which we will see in the future, where we go into Photoshop and set up images in a specific way that we can actually import and make use of that information inside After Effects. So for now, I'm just going to go to File, and I'm going to import this file called Balloon here. I'm going to import it, and as you can see, it recognizes that it is an AI file, and it's going to tell me, okay, how do you want to import this? And we're going to go into more detail as to how things are imported into the program, but know that there are options when you're importing. You can either import an item as footage or as a composition. When you're importing just the file itself as something that you're going to use, then you will choose footage. If you're going to use it as a composition, I will explain how to do that when we start talking about bringing in footage with several layers in it. So it requires pre-production in other programs such as Illustrator or Photoshop. You can also, if you have a file that is footage and it has several layers in the original program, such as Illustrator or Photoshop, you can choose the layer from the drop-down menu to choose what you want to import if you don't want to import everything. Now, you can also merge down all the layers, and basically you bring in that file as a flattened file. However, if the file is an Illustrator file, the background will be transparent. So let's say I choose layer 1 from this file that I'm importing, even though that's the only layer I have, so that works. I can also choose how I want the file, how big I want that file to be. Whether I want it to just be the footage size, meaning if my footage is smaller than my window in Illustrator or Photoshop, then my footage will be trimmed to those dimensions. It disregards the size of the artboard or the canvas on your Photoshop file. Or if you want it to be the canvas size or the artboard size if it comes from Illustrator. So you can choose which one of those fits your needs at the moment. I'm going to simply say layer size, and I'm going to click OK. Now you'll notice that this comes in and it shows you the little icon for an AI file. It tells you the name of the file. So that tells me that is a piece of footage, is a graphic. And I can also read what other pieces of information are given to me up here, such as the dimensions of the file, what this one indicates the ratio of the pixels. So I see that they are square pixels. And it tells me how many colors it has, which is millions plus, which means it has an alpha channel. If this is millions of color plus, it usually means that there's some kind of alpha channel being applied to that particular layer. Now, I'll explain what an alpha channel is in more detail in the near future, but for now, know that an alpha channel is basically a mask. Just like if you apply a mask to a layer in Photoshop, that's what an alpha channel is in this program. So every piece of footage can come in with alpha information in it, meaning you have some sort of transparency in that footage. And in this case, it's telling me that the footage is being treated as straight, which means there is no changes to how the actual alpha channel was generated from Illustrator. And that's exactly what I want. So now, in order to put that layer into this composition, I can either drag the file from here onto the composition, and you see that it gives me a proxy rectangle as to where things are going to go. And it tends to snap to places like the center of the composition. If you scroll around, if you move it around, you see how it tries to snap, or to edges if that's what you want. You can also drag it from here to your composition window down here, to your timeline. Sorry. So if you drag it into the timeline, what's going to happen is it's going to place it smack in the center of your composition, and it creates the layer for you. Now, we're going to talk about layers in more detail next week. But for now, know that you have options as to what to do with these layers. And the first thing that you do with a layer, basically think of this timeline as a twofold piece. The left-hand side deals with things like Photoshop would. The right-hand side deals with things like Premiere would. So over here, you have a timeline which counts for time through the actual length of the composition or the animation that you're about to create. And on the left-hand side is where you manage things as if you were in Photoshop. Now, on the left-hand side here, where we see the layers window, is where we will be applying those transformation values. Now, the transformation values are based on, like I said at the beginning of this lecture, you're going to be working with keyframes. Once again, keyframes are a place in time where something happens. So how do we define what happens? Well, let's say, for example, I want this balloon to move across the screen, and I want that animation to take 1 second of time. So my balloon will move across the screen in 1 second. So first things first, I need to figure out where I want my animation to start in 2 ways. First, its position, and second, where in time do I want it to start? So I want it to start at the 0 mark. The 0 mark being at the 0000 point in my SMPTE code. So at the very beginning of the composition, that's where I want it to start. And then it's going to end at 1 second of time over here. Actually, let's make it 2 seconds so you guys can clearly see what the difference between those two spaces, the space of time is. So now, if I want to do this, where do I want now we go to the position change. So now I've defined where I want, in what space and time do I want this to happen. Now, where will be the position where this balloon starts moving from, and where does it end? I want it to start on the left-hand side of the screen, and I want it to go across and disappear on the right-hand side. So knowing that, I want to start my balloon where I want it started, which is right here. Now, you'll notice that I no longer see the footage once I go into the pasteboard, but I do get a little guide, little helper window with anchors around it that helps me see where things are going, or where things will be placed, or where they are located. Now, notice that if you move those anchors, I am deforming the scaling value of that balloon. Please be careful when doing this, because I see a lot of students trying to drag things from anchors, and that's what happens. When you want to move your footage, select the footage and then move it from the artwork itself. If you want to constrain the motion, you can select and then press the Shift key on your keyboard in order to drag and constrain in the X or Y angles. If you want to move on the Y angle only, up and down is Y, left and right is X. And make sure that you don't use the handles unless you intend to do scaling. And if you want to do scaling, my advice is always Shift. Always press Shift when you start scaling so that you maintain proportions. Because if you have footage that looks like this, it just looks sloppy, and you don't want to work with things like that. So you want to make sure that your work is high quality. So with that done, I want to move, like I said, my balloon to the left-hand side of the screen, and I see where it starts. And now I need to start defining the actual keyframes, the changes that are going to take effect. So the first keyframe will be for a position change. So I'll select that layer, and the shortcuts for keyframes are P is for position, A is for anchor point, R is for rotation, S is for scale, and T is for opacity or transparency. Okay, so if I want to call a transformation position change for this layer, I'll select the layer on the timeline, and then I can do one of two things. I can press the P key on the keyboard, which will call its position value. If I press it again, it disappears. Or I can uncollapse the layer. When I uncollapse the layer, I see the transformations list. When I click on the transformations list, I see all of the different options for transformations. We're going to talk about all of these in more detail in the next week's lecture. But for now, note that if you want to create a keyframe, first and foremost, you need to start by setting up the original keyframe. That means the keyframe reference from where you're going to start animating. Okay? More often than not, a lot of students forget to do this step, and then they go make the changes, and then when they go playback, nothing happens. And the reason for that is because they never set up that original keyframe. To set up an original keyframe, you will either use a shortcut, which I will show you next week when we talk about the transformations in detail, or you can press on this little stopwatch icon to the left of the name of the transformation. So in our case, we want to change the position keyframe. So if I click on that stopwatch, you'll notice that the stopwatch turned blue, which indicates that that layer has been set up for position keyframes. It has been set up for so that anytime I change a position, a new keyframe will be generated. You will also notice that a little diamond shape appears on the left-hand side, which says to you, my time marker is right over a keyframe on that transformation. So as you can see, my time marker on the timeline is over that keyframe, and I also see a keyframe appear on the actual timeline. So three things happen at the same time. Now that creates a keyframe here where that animation is going to start, meaning when the animation starts, something happened in time. The thing started moving. So that means there's a keyframe there. Then I'll go to my 2-second time mark. Remember, I can go 200, which means 2 seconds, 0 frames. Hit return, and then you'll see that I get to the 2-second mark with my time marker. Then all I have to do is simply click and drag on the artwork to the other side. Now you'll notice that by doing that, because the layer had been set up by having activated that stopwatch already, I noticed that I didn't click it for the second keyframe. It automatically added the keyframe by me moving the artwork, which means these are almost like tags saying this layer for this particular transformation or for this particular property is already being tagged, so that anytime that you do something to it based on this property, it will create a new keyframe. That's one thing. So second, make sure that you never click on that stopwatch unless you intend to, because if you click on the stopwatch, let's watch one right now. I'm going to click. It removes all of the keyframes from your layer, so you no longer have animation anymore on that layer. And if I scrub my playback head, you'll notice that I don't have any motion. So let me undo that really quick so that I bring my keyframes back. Control Z is undo. And notice that if I scrub my video, my balloon goes across the screen. So if I want to preview this, I have two options. I can click on that preview window on the right-hand side to create a preview, or I can always press my space bar. So if I place my time marker back again at the beginning, I press the space bar, it creates a preview. You will notice that I get a little green line up here. Anything that's under the green line will be playing back at real time, meaning it's going to play back at the speed at which you were going to see it when you export the file. The more RAM you have, the more green line you're going to get in your previews. The less RAM that you have in your computer, the less the amount of preview that you can have. Previews are affected by the amount of footage that you have, by the amount of keyframes that you have, and by the amount of motion that you have on the screen. So the more you have of all these things that I just mentioned, the smaller your previews will be. But like I said at the very beginning of the course, we don't worry about this because usually when we're working with After Effects, our changes are usually somewhere between, for the footage that we work on, we don't do 10 minutes worth of video created in After Effects. If you're creating 10 minutes worth of video in After Effects, then you should be looking at other programs to create footage for you that you can bring into After Effects for post. Most likely you won't go beyond 1 minute or 2 minutes in the animations that you're creating. In most cases, actually, things being just little snippets that take seconds within an actual larger piece of footage. So that is how you create keyframes within a layer. You will also notice that by having created those keyframes, I see a path that connects them. That path is what we call the in-between path. meaning the space in between the keyframes. So in order for you to actually see where things are happening within that animation, that path is drawn for you. All of those little dots in that in-between path indicate each one of the frames in the timeline here, which means that every frame is indicated by a dot. That means that if I look at all, and if I had a ruler and I could measure the space between all those frames, we get what we call linear motion. And linear motion refers to the speed of playback being constant between the keyframes, meaning when I play this back, and actually I'm just gonna reduce my work area being this blue line, this gray line, sorry, with the blue handles at the top. I'm gonna move my endpoint to the 2-second mark, and I'm gonna press shift as I'm dragging so that it snaps. And that will be the area that I'm working on. So if I create a preview right now, it's only gonna preview those first 2 seconds. And it's gonna keep on looping on that preview because I have it set up to loop under my preview window. If I move this down, you can see that I will have things set up for preview. So you can actually go ahead and set up how you want your previews to work. By default, the previews will be looping. Okay, so now you can see that the motion is linear. There is no acceleration or deceleration. If we want to accelerate or decelerate that motion, then we need to change what we call the interpolation between the keyframes. And the interpolation is the way one keyframe talks to another. If you look in detail to these keyframes, you will notice that the rhombus shape, which is that diamond shape, is actually divided into two, a left-hand side and a right-hand side. A keyframe indicates motion happening, or the speed of change happening as the action comes into the keyframe and as it leaves the keyframe. What that means for you is that if I have linear motion, these two keyframes are saying to each other, the in-between space between us, every frame should be equally distanced in time and the amount of change, the speed of change. If I want to accelerate or decelerate, then I need to select the point where I want to say, okay, from this point out, accelerate. Or when I want to decelerate, I want to select another keyframe and say, when you're coming into this keyframe, start slowing down as you come into it. So to do that is fairly easy. We're going to look in more detail how to use what we call the graphing editor in about a week. But know that basically what you have the ability to control that from quickly to actually add more natural motion by simply selecting one of the keyframes. And if I right click on that keyframe from the flyout menu, I get what is called Keyframe Assistant. And from that Keyframe Assistant, I can apply easy ease in, which means slow down when you're coming into me, or easy is out, which means slow down as you leave that keyframe. So the keyframe is saying when you're coming towards me, when you're coming, when the change is happening towards me, slow down. That would be easy ease in. That means decelerate. And when you are taking off and you want to slowly gain speed on the change, you want to easy ease out, meaning you're going to start accelerating. You're just not going to take off at a linear speed. So when, let's say in this case, since this is my second keyframe, I'm going to right click, go to Keyframe Assistant, and then I'm going to say easy ease in. You will notice that the tween frames got closer to one another on the path over here. You'll see that the tween frames got closer, which means they're moving less space in the same amount of time. And that means basically you're decelerating. Let's take a look at the end result of this. You'll see how it's very negligible, but you can actually see it slowing down as it goes towards the right-hand side. Let's make it accelerate coming out of this one. So I'll right-click, Keyframe Assistant, easy ease out. You'll notice how they, the tween frames got closer to one another, which means they're going to accelerate, achieve some sort of speed, and then decelerate as they go towards the other frame. Let's take a look and see what that looks like. Slow down fast and slow. Slow down fast and slow. Slow down fast and slow. So the actual keyframes are actually doing what the tween frames are doing what they're supposed to do by my changing the interpolation between them. So remember, interpolation is how the keyframes talk to one another and how that affects the actual tween frames, the in-between frames. So interpolation is that control that you have to accelerate or decelerate. You can go as detailed as you want on how this speed of change happens once we talk about the graphing editor. For now, know that this is something that you do naturally to any animation to make it look more natural, because things seldom move at linear speed in the real world. So when you see an animation, you want to mimic those principles of animation we talked about last week. You want to look for those principles of animation so that you can actually make your animations look more natural compared to mechanical things. That is what most things look like when you animate them without having any interpolation applied to them, okay, or any interpolation changes. So that is how we do ECs in, ECs out, and how we access interpolation. You notice also that the shape of the keyframe changed. And that means that something was applied to that keyframe. Either it got accelerated or decelerated. So you'll notice that now the actual diamond shape is no longer a diamond shape. It looks like an arrow. It looks like the left side of this keyframe got pushed in. And in this case, it got pushed out towards pushed in towards the other side. So that is the shape of this particular type of interpolation that has been applied to that keyframe. There are other options for keyframe interpolation, which you find under the Keyframe Interpolation flyout menu. And we're going to talk about those in more detail as we progress through the class. But you can do things such as hold a keyframe, meaning don't let it make any changes as you go. And you can also change the temporal and spatial interpolations, which affect properties that change over time for temporal. And in this one, spatial interpolation would be properties that change over space. So that means things such as position. And then temporal things would be things that change over time, such as opacity or scaling. So we're going to talk about those in more detail in the near future. Just know that you have access to them by right-clicking and getting access to them from your keyframe interpolation options. And just to apply ECs in or ECs out, you have them from the Keyframe Assistant.